You do not lose your life in one big wrong decision. You lose it little by little each morning when you let the world step in before you do. When you open your eyes and react instead of lead. When you begin the day in haste instead of intention. And then you wonder why you are always busy but never moving forward. Why you try so hard yet your life never changes direction. The truth is, your life is not decided in loud moments. It is decided in the very early moments when no one is watching you. When the world is still asleep and it is only you facing yourself. If you want to change the trajectory of your life, you do not need to begin with something big. You only need to reclaim control of your morning. And from that moment on, nothing will ever be the same again. When the city lights are quiet and most of the world is still drifting in sleep, there is a moment silently deciding the entire direction of your life. Not the big decisions made in boardrooms or the dramatic turning points you will talk about later, but the very early moment when you open your eyes and choose your first response to a new day. Right now, you are not just waking up, you are choosing. You choose to keep living on familiar autopilot or to start leading yourself. You choose to let the day drag you along or to step out and take control. The world out there waits for no one, and it does not need to care how tired you are. It simply keeps moving, and every morning that passes in unconsciousness is a piece of the future handed away without you even noticing. When you hit snooze one more time, you are not only extending sleep, you are reinforcing a silent message that you are willing to delay yourself. And that message, repeated long enough, becomes an identity. The truth that is hard to hear is that most of life is decided in moments this small. Not loud, not dramatic, but steadily accumulated. While the world is still asleep, you have a rare window where silence has not yet been shredded by notifications and obligations, where the mind has not yet been pulled into reaction and defense. That is when you can choose to build instead of cope, choose to be proactive instead of chasing. This is not a story about waking up early to prove something to anyone. This is a story about whether you respect yourself enough to meet yourself before you meet the world. When you get up early, you are telling yourself that this future matters enough to be prepared for. You are creating space to think clearly, to set direction, to establish a rhythm of life the way you choose, instead of by outside pressure. The people who go far are not the ones who have more time, but the ones who use the pivotal moment before the rest of the world can pull them into the whirlwind. Right here, the question is no longer whether you can wake up early, but whether you are willing to step out of the reactive version of you and become the one who leads your life. Before the sun rises, you are standing at an invisible boundary. On one side is the familiar road where today looks exactly like yesterday. On the other side is the road of those who choose to build before they get swept away. This moment does not need anyone to witness it. It only needs you awake enough to choose. You do not lose your life in one big wrong decision, but in thousands of stolen mornings taken away gently and quietly. There is no crisis, no warning, no moment that shocks you into realizing everything is drifting off course. It simply begins with opening your eyes and letting the world step in before you ever step out. Your phone lights up and notifications pull your attention instantly. Work messages place you into reaction mode before you even remember who you are. News carries other people's anxiety straight into a mind that is not fully awake yet. Your day has not started, but your energy is already being drained piece by piece. Morning, which should be the purest time of the day when the mind is still soft, when direction has not yet been fixed, when your power of choice is at its highest, becomes a gateway for everything external to invade. And when this repeats long enough, you become accustomed to living in a state of being pulled. You get used to feeling busy without knowing where you are going. You get used to ending the day exhausted and starting the next one sluggish. No one tells you that your life is being taken. It simply slips away in silence. The danger is that this state does not cause immediate pain. It only creates a vague feeling that you have potential you never reach, that you are always preparing but never beginning, that you understand a great deal but action is always delayed. And every morning that passes this way, you unknowingly reinforce a loop. Waking up in reaction, living in distraction, ending in exhaustion, then repeating. This loop does not destroy you instantly, it erodes you slowly. It dulls your ability to focus, weakens your will, and makes you doubt yourself. You begin to believe you lack discipline, lack motivation, lack capability. When the truth is, you never truly had a stable starting point to live the day as a leader of your own life. When the morning is stolen, you do not just lose time, you lose direction. You let urgent but unimportant things dictate your rhythm. You let temporary emotions decide the quality of your actions. You let other people's schedules take over your golden hours. And this happens so reasonably that you do not resist. You tell yourself you just need to check quickly, that you must respond immediately, that you have no other choice. But that very reasonableness is the trap, because no one forces you to give away your morning except the habit that has formed over time. When you do not intentionally design your morning will be designed by everything else. From there, your day becomes a chain of reactions. You chase tasks, chase demands, chase expectations, but rarely chase your own vision. At some point, you begin to feel like you are living someone else's life. You complete many things but build nothing with lasting meaning. You spend your energy keeping everything from falling apart, instead of creating something that moves forward. And all of it begins with mornings where you never truly showed up for yourself. When the world steps in first, you learn to defend. When you step out before the world, you learn to lead. The difference lies in the first few minutes of the day, but the consequences stretch across years. There are people who are not smarter, not luckier, yet they always feel like they are on the right path. Because every morning they place one small brick for their future before anyone else can take their attention away. Meanwhile, many others continue to let their mornings be stolen and then wonder why their life never truly feels like their own. This is not an accusation, but a truth that needs to be faced directly. You do not need more motivation, you need to reclaim the starting point. Because when you take back your morning, you do not just take back time, you take back control. And that is the first step to ending the way life quietly slips away. There is an uncomfortable truth that very few people dare to face, which is that you do not fail because you are lazy, but because you are trapped inside an invisible operating mechanism. A mechanism that keeps you constantly in motion, but rarely moving forward. You wake up in a rush, dive into to-do lists, respond to messages, handle other people's problems, and end the day feeling drained. From the outside, you look responsible, hard-working, and busy. But on the inside, there is a question that repeats day after day. Why do I try so hard, and yet my life does not move upward? The answer lies in how the human brain is programmed to prioritize reaction over direction. When you do not intentionally set direction at the start of the day, the brain automatically searches for the closest, easiest, and most familiar stimuli. That is notifications, that is urgency, that is requests that feel pressing, but do not necessarily create long-term value. The brain loves quick completion, loves instant rewards, loves solving a problem immediately. And that is exactly what creates the illusion of progress. You complete many tasks, but very few of them move you closer to the person you want to become. This mechanism works with great subtlety. Each time you respond quickly, you feel useful. Each time you finish a small task, you feel a brief sense of satisfaction. These small rewards convince the brain that you are on the right path. But over time, a paradox appears. The busier you become, the less time you have for what truly matters. You stay stuck managing consequences instead of building causes. You work for the present while neglecting the future. This is not a personal flaw, but the result of a life system that was never designed. When you do not clearly define your highest priority, the brain will prioritize whatever is loudest. When you do not protect focus, energy becomes fragmented. And when energy is fragmented, you cannot go deep long enough to create meaningful value. Real progress in life does not come from doing more, but from doing the right thing in a state of deep focus. But that state never naturally appears in a day that begins with reaction. You cannot expect clarity at noon if your morning is chaos. You cannot expect creativity if your mind has already been stretched thin by too many small tasks. This invisible mechanism is even more dangerous because it turns you against yourself. You think you lack discipline, lack willpower, lack motivation. You search for more advice, more methods, more inspiration. While the root problem is that you never truly created space to think strategically. You live in constant survival mode, reacting to whatever comes closest. And in that mode, the brain is not designed to think long-term. It only tries to get through today. Gradually, you become used to the feeling of always running, without knowing where you are running toward. You set goals, but rarely have time to return to them. You have dreams, but they are always pushed aside by something more urgent. And then you begin to believe that this is just how life is, that everyone is busy, that everyone is tired, that there is no time for anything bigger. But the truth is, there is a small group of people who have escaped this mechanism, not because they have more hours, but because they control the most decisive moment of the day. They understand that if they do not set direction at the beginning, the entire day will be pulled by inertia. So, they create intentional stillness before the world asks anything of them. In that stillness, they do not solve other people's problems. They solve their own. They do not react, they direct. And this small difference creates a massive gap over time. When you start the day by identifying what truly matters, the brain automatically filters out noise. When you give your best energy to building instead of firefighting, you create real progress. The invisible mechanism that keeps you busy but not moving forward only exists when you do not see it. When you look directly at it, you begin to have choice. You realize that being busy does not mean being effective, that completing tasks does not mean progressing, that a day passing does not mean you are on the right path. And at this point of awareness, a door begins to open, a door to a different way of living, where you are no longer carried by the current, but begin learning how to swim against it in the most important moments. When you understand the mechanism that has been controlling you, you stop blaming yourself. You begin to rebuild, and that rebuilding always starts in the morning, where you reclaim the right to decide what your first energy will be used for. There is a very quiet yet heavy moment when you suddenly realize that it is not major events controlling your life, but the way you step into each day. Not next year, not vague long-term plans, but today. Not explosive motivation or intense emotion, but small choices repeated consistently. Today is not just a unit of time passing by. It is a brick, and you have built your life by the way you have placed those bricks over many years. When you look back, you will see that very few turning points happened in dramatic moments. Most meaningful change begins with a very small shift in how daily life is lived. And that shift always starts at the beginning of the day, when you are still most intact. This is when you begin to understand an important truth. You do not need more time. You need to change the starting point. Because the way you begin your day determines how you use your energy, where your attention goes, and who you become by the time that day ends. If you begin in a state of being pulled, the entire day becomes a chain of reactions. If you begin in a proactive state, the entire day has structure, not because everything becomes easier, but because you have an axis to return to. Many people believe they will change when conditions improve, when work becomes more stable, when they have more time, when pressure eases. But that rarely happens, because external conditions are always shifting. If you wait for a perfect day to begin, you will wait forever. People who truly change understand that they cannot control everything that happens during the day, but they can control how they enter that day. And this small control creates a sense of agency. When you feel agency, you act differently. When you act differently, results change. This is the reverse chain reaction of the old loop. You no longer let results determine your emotions. You let structure determine action, and action determine results. Today, therefore, becomes a laboratory. You do not need to change your entire life in one morning. You only need to design the way you start the day to reflect the person you want to become. When you spend the morning thinking clearly, you make better decisions. When you give the first energy of the day to what matters most, you create real progress. When you keep a small promise to yourself right after waking up, you build self-respect. And that self-respect spreads into every other area. You begin to say no more easily. You focus more deeply. You become more patient with long-term goals. You no longer need to push yourself with emotion, because you already have a system that supports you. The moment you recognize the power of today is also the moment you stop blaming the past. You no longer dwell on what you missed. You simply focus on placing one good brick right now. This brings a deep sense of relief. You no longer have to carry your entire life on your shoulders. You only need to take responsibility for your morning, and that is enough for everything else to begin shifting. Many people underestimate the impact of starting the day with clarity. But think about this. Your brain is like a navigation system. It needs a destination to adjust direction. If you do not provide that destination at the beginning of the day, it will chase the strongest signal it encounters. That is notifications. That is problems. That is pressure. But if you take a little time early to establish what truly matters, the brain will automatically filter out what is unnecessary. You do not need stronger willpower. You need clearer signals. Today is also where momentum is built. When you have a well-designed morning, you enter the rest of the day with a psychological advantage. You have done something difficult before the day even begins. You have defeated procrastination before it has a chance to appear. And this victory is not big, but it is real. It creates a feeling that you are ahead. That feeling influences how you speak to others, how you handle problems, how you respond to pressure. You are no longer reactive, you are proactive. Over time, days that begin this way create a completely different trajectory. Not because every day is perfect, but because the direction has changed. A very small deviation each day, over many years, leads you to a completely different place. And the important thing is that you do not need to believe this as blind faith. You only need to try living one day with a different starting point. A day where you do not let the world define you before you define yourself. A day where you meet yourself before you meet anyone else. When you experience that difference, you will no longer ask whether today matters. You will know, because you will feel the shift in how you move through that very day. And from this moment of realization, a new journey truly begins. A journey where each day is no longer something to get through, but an opportunity to place another brick in the right direction for your life. When you look at 5 a.m. as a time, you see it as difficult, inconvenient, and unnecessary. But when you look at 5 a.m. as a strategic advantage, you begin to understand why so many people have completely changed the trajectory of their lives simply by shifting their starting point. This advantage does not lie in the clock. It lies in the context. 5 a.m. is the moment before the world begins to make demands. There is no pressure, no interruption, no one needing a response from you. In that rare space, you have full ownership of your attention. And attention is the most valuable asset of this era. When you control your attention, you control the quality of your thinking. When the quality of your thinking changes, the quality of your decisions changes. This is a chain of cause and effect that very few people recognize because they are too busy chasing outward appearances. 5 a.m. gives you an unfair advantage in a very quiet way. While most of the world begins the day in haste, you begin in intention. While others use their first energy to handle problems, you use it to build foundations. Not because you are better, but because you chose the right moment to do the hardest work. The human brain performs best before it is fragmented. Willpower is strongest before it is worn down by small decisions, and creativity is clearest when the mind is still. 5 a.m. brings all three together. This is not a call to sacrifice sleep or force yourself into becoming someone else. It is an invitation to reconsider how you are using your highest quality energy. Many people spend the best hours of the day consuming and the most exhausted hours trying to create something meaningful. That is a paradox, and that paradox explains why they always feel behind, despite trying so hard. When you move the most important work to the beginning of the day, you reverse that paradox. You build when energy is full. You leave reactive tasks for when energy has declined. This does not only improve performance, it changes how you feel about yourself. You no longer end the day with the sense that you missed what mattered most. You carry a deep feeling of completion, and that feeling feeds natural motivation for the next day. 5 a.m. is also when you are most honest with yourself. There is no one to impress, no audience, just you, and the questions you usually avoid once the day becomes too loud. You can look directly at what you are building and what you are avoiding. You can set direction without being influenced by outside opinions. This is when you are not just working, you are shaping. You are shaping how you think, how you prioritize, how you see the future. And those shapes flow into every action that follows. The strategic advantage of 5 a.m. also lies in consistency. When you choose a time that few people intrude upon, it becomes easier to protect. You do not need to negotiate with the world. You only need to keep a promise to yourself. That consistency creates momentum, and momentum is what determines long-term difference. Not explosive effort, but small actions repeated under favorable conditions. 5 a.m. creates those conditions. It makes doing the right thing easier than delaying. And when the right thing becomes easy, you no longer have to battle yourself every day. You simply show up. There is a common misconception that waking up early is for people with simple lives. The truth is the opposite. Those with the most responsibility need an uninterrupted space to think and to set direction. 5 a.m. does not take time from you. It gives time back by reducing chaos. When priorities are set early, you are less easily pulled into what does not matter. You say no more easily. You focus more deeply. You decide faster, because you already know where you are going. And it all begins with creating a still point in the current. 5 a.m. is that point. It does not promise miracles. It promises a small but durable advantage. An advantage that compounds day after day. An advantage that does not depend on motivation, but on structure. When you understand this, you stop asking whether you can wake up early. You begin asking whether you are willing to keep giving this advantage away to others. Because every morning you do not use for yourself is a morning you allow the world to decide for you. And over time, those small decisions draw the entire trajectory of your life. 5 a.m., therefore, is not a habit. It is a quiet declaration of how you choose to live. You choose to build before you react. You choose to lead before you are pulled along. You choose to lay foundations before facing pressure. And when this choice is repeated long enough, it is no longer a choice. It becomes how you operate. From here, the journey no longer revolves around whether to wake up early or not. It shifts to a deeper question. What will you do with the strategic advantage that very few people dare to hold? And that is where the map begins to come into clearer view. Once you see the strategic advantage of 5 a.m., the natural question arises. What should you do during that time to create real change? Not doing more, but doing what matters better. Not stuffing tasks, but designing a blueprint clear enough to guide you in the right direction every morning. The difference between people who wake up early but change nothing, and those who use the first 60 minutes to transform their lives, lies in structure. This blueprint does not depend on emotion. It works even when motivation is low, because it is built on the principle of using energy at the right time and minimizing unnecessary decisions. The truth is that morning is not the time to figure out what to do. Morning is the time to execute what has already been designed. People who take control of their lives do not allow ambiguity into the first 60 minutes of the day. They enter with an order that has already been defined. That order begins with waking the body before waking the mind. Water and gentle movement send signals of safety to the nervous system, helping the brain exit stagnation. When the body is awake, the mind finally has a foundation for focus. Next comes a period of intentional stillness, not to escape reality, but to see it clearly. This is when you meet yourself in silence, asking what is the single most important thing that needs to be built today. Not a long list, but one clear focus. That focus becomes the axis for every decision that follows. Once the axis is clear, everything else begins to align. After stillness comes building time. This is the core of the blueprint. The first 60 minutes of the day are used for the highest leverage work, writing strategic ideas, learning a key skill, designing long-term plans, or doing deep work that requires full concentration. No notifications, no responses, no distractions. Just you and the most important task. This creates real progress, because you are using your best energy for the hardest work. When the hardest work is handled early, the rest of the day becomes lighter. This blueprint also includes a critical principle: ending the morning with acknowledgement. You look back at what you completed and recognize your effort, not to inflate pride, but to reinforce identity. You send a clear message to the brain that you are someone who keeps promises to yourself. This message is more powerful than any external encouragement. It builds self-respect, and self-respect is the foundation of sustainable discipline. People who take control of their lives understand that discipline does not come from force, but from consistency under favorable conditions. The first 60 minutes of the day provide those conditions. When you repeat this blueprint every morning, you do not need to think much. You simply show up, and that consistent presence creates momentum. Momentum turns what once felt difficult into something familiar. Momentum removes the need to negotiate with yourself. Momentum allows action to happen before procrastination has a voice. The blueprint is also designed to be flexible within structure. Not every day looks the same, but the framework remains constant. This helps you keep rhythm even during high-pressure periods. When life becomes chaotic, the morning blueprint becomes an anchor. It reminds you who you are and what you are building. It keeps you from being swept away by temporary emotion. And most importantly, it allows progress to continue even when motivation drops. There is a common misunderstanding that a blueprint is a rigid schedule. In reality, it is a decision made in advance, so you do not have to decide when energy is still fragile. Every decision saved is a unit of willpower preserved. When willpower is preserved, you can spend it on what truly matters later in the day. This is why successful people appear calm, not because they have less to do, but because they eliminated many unnecessary decisions at the very beginning of the day. The first 60 minutes are therefore not just working time, they are design time. Designing the day, designing the week, designing direction. When you design enough good days, you no longer need to redesign your life. Life naturally forms in the direction you have chosen. This blueprint also teaches a deep lesson about patience. You do not see massive results immediately, but you see small progress every day, and those small gains compound into turning points. People who quit often do so because they chase fast change. People who go far focus on the right structure and allow time to do the rest. When you step out of the first 60 minutes feeling that you have built something, you enter the rest of the day with a quiet confidence. You do not need to prove anything. You already know you are moving in the right direction. That feeling spreads into how you communicate, how you decide, how you face pressure. You are no longer chasing, you are leading. The blueprint of the first 60 minutes is therefore not a rigid formula. It is an operating philosophy. A philosophy that says you deserve the best time of your own day. A philosophy that says great things are built in silence before they are seen. A philosophy that says taking control of life does not begin by changing the world, but by controlling how you begin the day. And when this philosophy is repeated long enough, it is no longer a habit. It becomes the foundation for everything you build next. Before any lasting change can happen, There is a door that must be opened, and that door lives in belief. Not technique, not schedules, not tools, but the quiet stories you have believed about yourself for years. These stories sound so reasonable that you rarely question them. You think you are not an early morning person, that your body does not work well in the morning, that you need inspiration before you can start, that discipline is a form of self-punishment meant only for a special few. Each belief is like a soft rope, a rope that does not tighten immediately but is strong enough to keep you in place. When you accept these beliefs, you do not need to fail, you simply do not begin. And not beginning for long enough becomes a way of life. The most dangerous thing about false beliefs is that they disguise themselves as personal truth. You say, "This is how I was born, I already tried, and it did not work, my situation is different." But look more closely. Most of these beliefs do not come from full experience, but from a few unstructured attempts. You tried waking up early while sleep-deprived, unprepared, without clear intention, and then concluded it was not for you. You set big goals without breaking them down, and then concluded you lacked discipline. You waited for inspiration, and then concluded you lacked motivation. These are not conclusions, they are misunderstandings. Because people do not fail from lack of ability, but from using the wrong system. When you observe those you believe to be disciplined, you will see that they do not rely on willpower more than you do. They rely on structure. They do not wait for inspiration. They create conditions where action happens before emotion has time to interfere. The belief that I am not an early morning person is really the belief that I have not yet built a system that works for me. The belief that I need motivation is really the belief that action must come after emotion, when in reality, action often creates emotion. When you begin doing the right thing even before you feel ready, you create new evidence for the brain. And the brain believes evidence more than promises. Every morning you show up on time, even imperfectly, you are rewriting the story of who you are, not through words, but through action. Another very common false belief is that discipline kills freedom. You fear that if you become too disciplined, life will turn rigid and dry. But look more carefully. Who truly has more choice? The person who wakes up rushed and reacts all day, or the person who completes the most important work before the world begins? Proper discipline does not take freedom away. It buys freedom back. It gives you the ability to choose what matters, instead of being pulled by what is loud. When you have a clear morning framework, you are not constrained. You are freed from chaos. You gain space to create, because the foundation is solid. The belief that my circumstances are different also needs to be faced honestly. Everyone has constraints, but constraints do not determine direction. How you respond to constraints does. Some people use circumstances as a reason to delay, others use them as a reason to design more intelligently. No one is asking you to copy someone else's schedule. What is required is honesty about your goals and a willingness to adjust structure to serve those goals. Breaking false beliefs does not mean attacking yourself. It means moving from an old story to a more useful frame. Instead of saying, "I am not an early morning person," you say, "I am learning how to protect my mornings." Instead of saying, "I lack discipline," you say, "I am building a system." Instead of saying, "I need inspiration," you say, "I need to show up." The language you use with yourself does not just describe reality, it creates it. When you change language, you change action. When you change action, you change results. There is an important moment in this process when you realize that you do not need complete belief in yourself at the beginning. You only need enough belief to try a new structure. You do not need certainty that you will succeed. You only need willingness to do the right thing for a few mornings in a row, and those mornings will provide new evidence. Evidence that you can keep small promises. Evidence that you can act before emotions stabilize. Evidence that you can create order in a short window of time. These pieces of evidence accumulate, and slowly they replace old beliefs. You do not force yourself to believe. You show yourself. Breaking false beliefs also means accepting imperfection. There will be late mornings, missed days, moments when you slip back into old habits. That does not ruin the journey. What ruins the journey is using those moments to reinforce the story that you cannot do it. The people who progress are not those who never drift. They are the ones who return quickly. And to return quickly, you need a new identity, the identity of someone who is building, not someone who is trying. When you see yourself as someone building a system, you do not panic over mistakes. You adjust and continue. The final belief that must be broken is the belief that change must be big to matter. In reality, lasting change always begins small. Small enough that it does not scare you, clear enough that it does not confuse you, repeated enough that it becomes familiar. On the first morning, you simply show up. On the next, you hold the structure. On the next, you go a little deeper. There is no leap, only steady movement forward. When you break these false beliefs, you do not instantly become someone else. You become someone with choice. And that choice opens the door to the next part of the journey. The part where discipline is no longer a battle, but an identity quietly taking shape. There is a very subtle turning point in this journey where discipline stops being a battle and starts becoming the way you operate. That turning point does not come from trying harder, but from no longer negotiating with yourself every morning. Before, every time you woke up, you had to convince yourself that today you should do the right thing, and every act of convincing drained willpower. Willpower is not an unlimited resource. When it runs out, you fall back into old inertia. But when discipline becomes identity, you no longer need to convince yourself. You act because that is who you are becoming. This difference is enormous. A person who acts through effort becomes exhausted. A person who acts through identity becomes stable. Identity is not formed through affirmations. It is formed through repeated evidence. Every morning you show up on time. You place another brick in your new identity. You do not say you are disciplined. You show your brain that you are someone who keeps small promises. The brain learns through repeated action. When there is enough evidence, it updates the story of who you are. And when the story changes, action becomes more natural. This is why so many people fail when they try to change through emotion. Emotion comes and goes. Identity stays. When you see yourself as an early riser, you no longer ask whether you should wake up early today. That question has already been answered. You only ask what you will use this morning to build. To reach this point, you need to understand how the brain responds to habits. Every repeated behavior sends a signal about who you are. When you procrastinate, you are saying you are someone who delays. When you show up, you are saying you are someone who is reliable. No one else needs to hear it. Your brain hears it very clearly, and it adjusts future behavior to match that story. This is not vague philosophy. This is how the brain conserves energy. It prefers consistency. When you act in alignment with identity, the brain reduces resistance. When you act against identity, the brain creates friction. So the goal is not to force yourself to do hard things every day. The goal is to build an identity that makes the right thing feel natural. This begins very small, not by waking up and changing your entire life, but by waking up and completing one specific action you have committed to. It might be drinking water and sitting in stillness for a few minutes. It might be writing one page or reading a few passages. The action itself matters less than consistency, because every time you complete it, you are telling yourself that you are someone who does what you decided to do. When this repeats, you begin to feel a very subtle shift. Discipline no longer feels like a burden. It feels like part of you. You are not loudly proud. You feel grounded. That feeling spreads into other areas. You begin keeping promises at work. You take better care of your health. You say no to things that drain your energy. Not because you read more books or watched more videos, but because you changed how you see yourself. You are no longer someone trying to become better. You are someone living up to your own standard. Another important point is that when discipline becomes identity, you no longer need perfect conditions. You do not wait for everything to be ideal before acting. You act even when things are not ideal. This does not mean ignoring your body or emotions. It means you do not let temporary feelings decide long-term direction. You understand that there will be difficult mornings, but you also understand that skipping completely weakens the identity you are building. So you choose the minimal version, but you still show up. That appearance keeps the story unbroken, and continuity matters more than perfection. When you do not break the chain, you do not have to start over. You continue from where you are. This creates a feeling of continuous progress, and continuous progress fuels sustainable motivation far more than any promise ever could. Identity-based discipline also changes how you view failure. You no longer see an off day as proof that you cannot do it. You see it as data. You ask what caused the drift. You adjust the structure. You return. No drama, no self-blame. This is how people who go far operate. They do not tie their worth to a single day. They tie it to overall direction. And that direction is protected by identity. Once you cross this threshold, you begin to realize that discipline does not take freedom away. It creates space for real freedom. You are no longer pulled by small impulses. You are no longer trapped in constant decision-making. You have energy to think long-term. You have space to create. You have stability to build meaningful relationships and projects. It all begins when you stop seeing discipline as something you must force yourself to do. You see it as a natural expression of who you are becoming. And that person is not created in moments of inspiration. They are forged in the quiet of early mornings when no one is watching. When you step into the day with this identity, you do not need to prove anything to anyone. You know you are moving in the right direction. This certainty is not loud. It is calm, but it is powerful. It helps you stand steady when pressure arrives. It helps you stay patient when results have not yet appeared. It helps you continue even when no one is cheering. And from this foundation, a new door opens. A door that leads you deeper into understanding how energy and focus truly operate within you. A place where science is no longer theory, but becomes a tool for working with your body instead of fighting against it. Once you have moved past the stage of building identity and discipline begins to operate naturally, a deeper question appears. Why are there mornings when you feel alert, focused, and clear, while on other days everything feels heavy even though you have not done much differently? The answer does not lie in personality or motivation, but in biology. Your body is not an inert machine. It is a sophisticated system that responds to rhythm, light, sleep, movement, and habit. When you understand how this system works, you stop blaming yourself and begin cooperating with yourself. Energy is not willpower. Willpower is only the surface. Energy is the foundation, and that foundation is determined very early in the day. The human brain operates in rhythms. When you wake at the right time and give your body the right signals, you activate a chain of biological responses that increase alertness and focus. When you do the opposite, you create resistance. Many people try to focus by forcing themselves while the body is sending signals of fatigue. That is why their willpower runs out so quickly. Willpower is like a backup battery. It is not designed for constant use. When you rely on willpower to fight biology, you will lose. But when you arrange your morning to work with biology, willpower becomes almost unnecessary. One of the most important factors is light. When morning light enters the eyes, it sends a direct signal to the brain that a new day has begun. That signal activates hormones related to alertness and focus. If you wake in prolonged darkness or rely on weak artificial light, your body takes longer to shift into an active state. This explains why mornings that begin with natural light often come with greater clarity. The second factor is movement. The body is designed to wake through gentle movement. When you move, blood circulates more effectively, oxygen reaches the brain, and the nervous system receives the signal that you are entering an active state. This does not require intense exercise, just enough to wake the system. When the body wakes, the mind follows. The third factor is consistency of timing. The brain loves consistency. When you wake at the same time each day, your circadian rhythm synchronizes. This reduces friction in the morning. You do not have to fight to feel awake. The body prepares automatically. When your schedule constantly shifts, you create a state similar to jet lag. The body and brain fall out of sync. Fatigue appears not because you lack sleep, but because you are sleeping out of rhythm. Understanding this helps you reframe past failures, not because you were weak, but because you were working against your own biology. Focus follows the same principle. It is not an on-off switch. It is a state that is built. When you start the day by consuming fragmented information, the brain enters stimulus-seeking mode. That mode reduces the capacity for deep focus. When you begin with stillness and a single task, the brain learns to sustain attention. This difference is clear, yet often overlooked. Every morning, you are training your brain how it should operate for the day. You teach it to react quickly or to think deeply. You teach it to jump from one thing to another or to stay long enough to create value. Willpower is often treated as the deciding factor of success, but science shows that willpower declines over time as you make too many decisions. This is why successful people avoid important decisions late in the day when possible. They use the morning when willpower is full. When you spend willpower on small decisions early, there is little left for big ones. But when you design your morning to reduce decisions, you preserve willpower. You do not need to decide whether to do the important work. That decision was made earlier. You simply execute. This scientific truth releases you from immense pressure. You do not need to become stronger. You need to become smarter in how you arrange things. When you understand that fatigue is often a biological signal rather than a personal failure, you begin adjusting the environment instead of blaming yourself. You change light, you change movement, you change task order, and results change with them. Energy stops being a mystery. It becomes something you can manage. Focus stops being a rare gift. It becomes a skill trained through morning structure. Willpower stops being a battlefield. It becomes a resource you protect. When you view this journey through a scientific lens, you feel relief. You no longer fight yourself. You begin working with your body. And when you work with it, everything flows more smoothly. You no longer need to force discipline through tension. Discipline is supported by biology. This is the point many people miss. They try to change behavior without changing biological context, and so they return to old patterns. When you change context, new behavior has a chance to stay. This scientific truth also teaches humility. You cannot optimize every day. The body has cycles. There are high-energy days and low-energy days. The goal is not to always be at peak. The goal is to understand rhythm and work in alignment with it. When you understand rhythm, you do not panic on slower days. You adjust intensity. You keep structure. You do not break the foundation. This respect for biological rhythm creates durability, and durability matters more than intensity. When you build durability, you can go far without burning out. From here, the picture becomes clearer. Morning is not just time. It is the intersection of biology, psychology, and identity. When you design this intersection correctly, you do not just have better days, you have a better life system, and that system opens the path to the next step. The step where habits are no longer a to-do list, but an invisible architecture quietly shaping who you become each day. When you understand the scientific foundation of energy and focus, the next step is learning how to synchronize your biological rhythm so effort no longer feels like a constant tug of war. The biological rhythm is the internal clock that coordinates when you feel alert, sleepy, focused, or sluggish. It does not care about meeting schedules or personal goals. It responds to signals. When signals are clear and consistent, the brain prepares in advance. When signals conflict, the brain falls into confusion. Many people try to live with discipline while sending chaotic signals every day. They go to bed late and try to wake up early. They wake up in dim light and expect to feel alert quickly. They eat inconsistently and wonder why energy rises and falls. The result is that they use willpower to compensate for biology, and willpower does not win against biology in the long run. Synchronizing your biological rhythm does not mean living rigidly. It means creating stable anchors so the body can predict and prepare. The most important anchor is wake-up time. When wake-up time is consistent, the brain adjusts the release of hormones related to alertness and focus. You do not need a loud alarm. The body wakes itself. This state is often called natural, but it is actually the result of consistency. When wake-up time constantly changes, the body never has a chance to establish rhythm. You wake up, but the brain is still in night mode. You experience this as laziness, when in reality it is a biological signal. Morning light is the second strongest signal. Natural light in the early morning sends a clear message that the day has begun. It helps regulate the internal clock and improves sleep quality the following night. When you start the day with natural light, you are investing in both the day and the night. When you avoid morning light and expose yourself to strong light at night, you reverse the signals. The body becomes confused. You struggle to sleep and struggle to wake. This cycle repeats, and you believe you lack discipline. In truth, you are sending the wrong signals. Synchronization also relates to when you do difficult work. The brain has a natural focus window in the morning before fragmentation sets in. When you use this window for deep work, you move with biological flow. When you skip this window and try to do deep work late in the day, you must fight accumulated fatigue. This does not mean everyone is identical, but for most people, morning offers a clear advantage. Recognizing that advantage and arranging work accordingly is intelligence, not sacrifice. Another often overlooked factor is eating timing. A light, well-timed breakfast supports alertness. Heavy meals early can reduce energy. When you understand this, you stop eating out of habit and start eating to support your goals. This is not about complex diets. It is about observing how your body responds and adjusting. Synchronizing your biological rhythm also requires respecting rest cycles. Sleep is not extra. It is the foundation of the next day. When you treat sleep as an investment, you begin to protect it. You do not need perfection. You need enough consistency. One late night occasionally will not destroy rhythm. Many late nights in a row will disrupt it. When rhythm is disrupted, you must live on willpower, and living on willpower is expensive. When synchronization is strong, the difference is clear. Mornings feel lighter. Focus arrives faster. You do not need coffee to begin. You do not need force to continue. You enter work in a ready state. This state is not excitement, it is stability. And stability is the foundation of sustainable performance. Synchronization also teaches you when to slow down. There are low-energy days. When your biological rhythm signals this, you do not force deep work. You keep structure, but adjust intensity. You do maintenance work instead of building. This prevents burnout. Many people quit not because they are weak, but because they do not know how to adjust to rhythm. They try to maintain the same intensity every day until the body pushes back. When you work with rhythm, you go farther. Synchronizing your biological rhythm ultimately leads to an important realization. You do not need to become a super productive version of yourself every day. You need to become someone who listens to and leads their body. When you lead well, the body cooperates. When the body cooperates, the mind expands. And when the mind expands, you have space to build bigger things. This is a shift from force to cooperation, from fighting to coordination. When you reach this point, mornings are no longer a challenge. They become a support. You know that by holding a few core signals steady, everything else falls into place. You no longer fear losing motivation. You rely on rhythm, and rhythm is always there if you respect it. From this synchronized foundation, a deeper structure begins to form. The structure of habits, not habits as a to-do list, but as an invisible architecture quietly determining who you will become over the years ahead. There is a truth that is rarely seen yet determines nearly every outcome in your life, which is that most behavior happens without conscious thought. You believe you are choosing, while many of those choices have already been decided by habit. Habits are like invisible architecture. You do not see every wall, but you live inside it every day. When this architecture is built unconsciously, it limits you. When it is designed intentionally, it supports you. Every morning, you are adding another brick to that structure. No big decisions are required, only repetition. The brain loves to conserve energy. It turns repeated actions into automatic behavior. When an action becomes automatic, it no longer requires willpower. And when willpower is not required, you can sustain it long term. This is why habit outperforms motivation. Motivation comes and goes. Habits remain. But habits do not appear randomly. They are triggered by cues, guided by a sequence of actions, and reinforced by rewards. When you understand this structure, you stop hoping, you start designing. Morning cues can be very simple. Light entering the room, an alarm placed away from the bed, a glass of water prepared in advance. These cues tell the brain that a familiar sequence is about to begin. When cues are clear, the brain prepares. The action sequence also needs to be clear. Not a long list, but a short path you can follow even before you are fully awake. Drink water. Sit still for a few minutes. Open your notebook. Begin the most important task. When the sequence is short and fixed, the brain does not need to think. It simply follows the path. The reward does not need to be large. It can be the sense of relief that the hardest task is done, the quiet pride of keeping a promise, the feeling of being ahead before the day begins. These feelings teach the brain that this sequence is worth repeating, and when it is repeated enough times, the architecture begins to form. What matters most is that habits do not just create results, they create identity. When you repeatedly show up each morning, you become someone who shows up. When you repeatedly delay, you become someone who delays. No labels are required. The brain remembers clearly, and it behaves to protect that story. This is why changing a small habit can change an entire life. Because you are changing the underlying narrative. When that narrative changes, other decisions become easier. You no longer have to argue with yourself. You act in alignment with who you are becoming. A common mistake is trying to change too many habits at once. This causes the architecture to collapse before it has time to stand. The brain resists overload. The sustainable approach is to build pillar by pillar. One strong morning habit can pull others along. When you start the day with order, it becomes easier to maintain order in eating, work, and rest. Not because you force yourself, but because the architecture supports you. Morning habits also act as a filter. When you complete what matters early, you are less likely to be pulled into what does not. You no longer need to prove that you are busy. You choose selectively, and that selectivity creates depth. Depth in work, depth in thinking, depth in life. This invisible architecture also protects you on difficult days. When motivation is low, habit still operates. You do not need to feel ready. You simply follow the path. This does not turn you into a machine. It makes you stable, and stability is the condition for sustainable creativity. There is a paradox that the greatest freedom comes from the strongest structure. When you have structure, you are not pulled by impulses. You have space to choose. When you lack structure, you think you are free, but in reality you are constantly reacting. Habit architecture frees you from reaction. It gives you agency, a rare privilege in a noisy world. Habits also require maintenance. When life changes, the architecture must adjust. But adjusting does not mean tearing everything down. You keep the frame, you change the details, you still show up, you still begin, you still finish. This continuity keeps identity from breaking. When you miss a day, you do not turn it into a story. You return the next day. Strong architecture does not collapse from one crack. It stands because it has many pillars, and each pillar is a moment you showed up without being forced. One crucial point is that habits should not rely on external rewards. If you need large rewards to continue, you will stop when the reward disappears. The most sustainable reward is the feeling of becoming, the feeling that you are living up to your own standard. This feeling is quiet, but deep. It creates inner reassurance, and that reassurance spreads into every other decision. When habit architecture is in place, life begins to feel simpler. Not because there is less to do, but because there is less inner conflict. You no longer drag yourself forward. You are supported. Each morning is no longer a question. It is a ritual. This ritual is not religious. It is directional. It reminds you what you are building and how you are building it. This invisible architecture is not built in a week. It is built through hundreds of small repetitions, but once it stands, it creates enormous impact. It determines how far you can go without burning out. It determines whether you can sustain what you build. When you understand habits as architecture, you stop dismissing small actions. You know that every time you show up, you are placing another brick. And when there are enough bricks, you no longer need to push life forward. It stands on its own. From this foundation, you are ready to move to the next step, the step where you learn to design morning rituals intentionally, to remove hesitation and resistance before they have a chance to form. Hesitation is not the real enemy. Resistance is the quiet force that slowly destroys good intentions. And resistance does not appear because you are weak. It appears because the brain is designed to conserve energy and avoid what is unfamiliar. Every morning when you wake up, the brain faces a choice. Follow the old path or step into something new. If the new path requires too many decisions, the brain pulls you back into inertia. That is why the goal of a morning ritual is not to create motivation, but to remove friction points. A good ritual makes the right action the easiest option. It moves you from sleep into building without negotiation. The ritual begins the night before. When you prepare in advance, you send yourself a message that this morning matters. Clothes laid out are not about saving time. They are about avoiding decisions when willpower is still fragile. A notebook and workspace prepared are not decoration. They are tools to remove delay. Every item placed correctly removes one barrier. When you wake up, the environment leads you. You do not need to think, you simply follow. The first moment after waking decides a great deal. If that moment is the phone, the brain switches into reaction mode. If that moment is gentle movement or natural light, the brain switches into proactive mode. A morning ritual is designed to protect this moment, not with willpower, but with structure. The phone is not next to the bed. Light is turned on. Water is consumed immediately. These actions are not symbolic, they are biological. They tell the body that you are entering the day on your terms. After the waking moment comes the stabilization phase. This is when you create a pace slow enough that the mind does not panic. No complex meditation is required, just a few minutes of quiet. In that quiet, you are not searching for big answers. You are identifying one most important thing for the day, one thing that, if completed, would make the day meaningful. When this is clear, the brain has an anchor. It knows what it is working toward. Resistance decreases when the target is clear. Then comes the deep action phase. This is the part many people skip or rush through. They spend the morning preparing, but not building. A morning ritual is incomplete without value-creating action. This action must be decided in advance. No decisions are made in the morning. You simply open and do. When you do the most important work first, you send the brain a powerful message. You are someone who acts before distraction. Each time this message is reinforced, resistance weakens. Because the brain learns that this sequence ends with an internal reward, A ritual also needs a clear ending. An ending helps the brain recognize that the sequence is complete. This creates a sense of closure. No external reward is needed. Simply acknowledging that you did what you committed to do is enough. This acknowledgement reinforces habit, and habit reinforces identity. A common mistake is designing rituals that are too long and too complex. When a ritual becomes a burden, it creates new resistance. The goal is to simplify until you can execute even on hard days. A minimal but consistent ritual is stronger than a perfect ritual that breaks. You can expand later when the foundation is strong. In the beginning, repetition matters most. Resistance also comes from lack of clarity. When you do not know exactly what you will do, you delay. So, be specific. Not "I will work," but "I will open this document and write" for a defined period. Specificity cuts hesitation. The brain likes clarity, it dislikes ambiguity. A morning ritual is how you turn ambiguity into clarity. Another important factor is time. A ritual needs a fixed time frame, not to control you, but to create boundaries. Boundaries increase focus. You know you have protected time, and when it ends, you move into the rest of the day without a sense of loss. This prevents unconscious stretching. Designing a ritual also requires honesty about your life rhythm. You do not need to copy anyone else's ritual. You need one you can sustain. If you work early shifts, it will look different. If you have a family, it will look different. But the principles remain the same. Reduce decisions, protect attention, act early, end clearly. When these principles are applied, the morning ritual becomes a bridge that carries you from sleep into building without a drop. You no longer ask whether you should begin. You have already begun. And once you have begun, resistance has very little ground to stand on. Over time, you realize that the hardest part is not the work itself. The hardest part is starting, and a well-designed morning ritual does that hard part for you. It clears the path for action to flow naturally. It allows you to enter the day with a sense of agency, not control over everything, but control over how you show up. From this foundation, an important effect begins to appear, the effect of momentum, an invisible force that causes small changes to stop standing alone and start pulling one another forward. And it is this momentum that creates major turning points over time. There is an invisible force that determines how far you can go without forcing yourself. And that force is momentum. Momentum does not come from one big action. It comes from continuity. When one action naturally leads to the next, you do not need to restart every time. You are moving on a new inertia, and that inertia can work for you or against you. A well-designed morning ritual creates momentum at the very beginning of the day. When you complete an important task early, you carry a sense of progress with you. That feeling influences how you walk, how you speak, and how you make decisions. You no longer start from zero. You start from a small win. That win does not need recognition from anyone else. It is enough for the brain to believe that you are moving in the right direction. When the brain believes, it cooperates. And when it cooperates, everything feels lighter. Momentum also explains why consistent small changes outperform explosive efforts. A big change requires a lot of energy to maintain. When energy drops, you fall back to the old point. A small change is different. It does not demand much. You can maintain it even on difficult days, and because it is maintained, it accumulates, a little each day, one brick at a time. After a while, you look back and realize you are standing in a very different place. There was no leap, only steady movement forward. Momentum has another important property. It reduces resistance. When you have done something consistently, the brain no longer sees it as a threat. It becomes familiar, and when it is familiar, willpower is no longer required. This explains why beginners struggle more than those who have already gone some distance. Not because they are weaker, but because they have not yet built momentum. When you understand this, You stop comparing yourself to those who are further along. You focus on creating momentum for yourself. And momentum always begins small. There is a temptation to do everything at once when you see the bigger picture. But that temptation destroys momentum before it can form. Because when you set too many goals, you create too many points of failure, and every failure point weakens belief. The smarter approach is to choose one leverage point. Morning is that point. When you stabilize your morning, you create a ripple effect. You eat better because you are not rushed. You work with more focus because priorities are already set. You rest better because you are not carrying the feeling of having missed something important. These effects do not come from trying to improve every area. They come from changing the route. Momentum also compounds over time. In the early days, you do not see much difference. After a few weeks, you begin to feel stability. After a few months, you notice clarity. Over a longer period, you realize that you have changed the way you respond to life. You do not panic under pressure. You do not delay when facing difficult tasks. You do not need to be pushed. These responses are not the result of one big decision. They are the result of hundreds of mornings started the right way. One important thing to understand is that momentum can be lost if you break the chain too often. But losing momentum is not permanent failure. It is simply a signal to return to the origin point. You do not need to compensate. You do not need to do more. You only need to do again what you did when momentum first began. Show up, keep the ritual, complete one task. Momentum will return faster than you expect, because the architecture is already there. This is the advantage of building correctly from the start. You do not rebuild from zero, you restore. Momentum also changes how you see time. You become less impatient. You understand that meaningful things must be accumulated. You no longer measure progress by momentary emotion. You measure it by consistency. This makes you steadier. You are not pulled by good days or bad days. You look at the trend, and the trend gives you calm. When you have momentum, you also begin to attract the right opportunities. Not because the universe arranges them, but because you are in a ready state. You notice opportunities faster. You act more decisively. You follow through. Others may say you are lucky, but you know that this luck was built through very ordinary mornings. There is a critical turning point when you realize that you do not need to push your life forward. You only need to create the right momentum. When momentum becomes strong enough, it pulls you forward on its own. You no longer ask whether you should act today. You are already in motion, and motion tends to continue. This is why the starting point matters so much. When you start correctly, you do not just have a good day. You create a chain of good days, and that chain shapes a different life. When you understand the power of momentum, you stop dismissing small changes. You protect them, you nurture them, because you know that these small things, repeated under the right conditions, create the turning points you once believed were reserved for others. From here, a new question appears. When momentum has been created and sustained, what happens next? What shifts more deeply in how you see yourself and the world? The answer lies in the relationship between you and the promises you make to yourself. A relationship that determines every other area of your life. There is a foundational relationship that quietly determines the quality of every other relationship in your life. And that is the relationship between you and the promises you make to yourself. When this relationship is weak, you constantly doubt yourself. You hesitate to set big goals because you are not sure you will follow through. You are easily influenced by outside opinions because you lack an inner anchor. But when you begin to keep small promises every morning, a deep shift occurs. It is not loud, not dramatic, but it is real. You begin to trust yourself more, and when you trust yourself more, every other decision becomes steadier. Keeping promises to yourself is not a moral act, it is a capacity-building act. Each time you do what you committed to, the brain records that you are reliable. This trust does not need to be declared, it is felt. It shows in how you enter a room, in how you speak, in how you face difficulty. You do not need to affirm it. You already know. And this knowing creates a rare kind of calm. When you have inner calm, you no longer overreact. You do not panic when plans change. You do not quit when obstacles appear. You adjust, because you already have evidence that you can return to what you decided. What is interesting is that the outside world also begins to respond differently. When you keep promises to yourself, you become consistent. That consistency sends a clear signal to others. They know you are someone who follows through. They trust your words. Opportunities come not because you try to impress, but because you have built credibility through small actions no one sees. This credibility cannot be faked. It is felt almost immediately, but its root is not in achievement. It is in quiet discipline. When you have completed the most important work early in the morning, you enter the day from a different position. You do not need to prove yourself through busyness. You do not need to talk much. You know you have done what needed to be done. This frees you from the pressure to perform, and when you are free from pressure, you work better, you listen better, you think more clearly. Keeping promises to yourself also changes how you relate to time. You no longer see time as something that is passing. You see it as raw material being used. You value silence. You protect important time blocks. You no longer fill the day with activity to avoid emptiness. You accept stillness, because you know stillness is where things are built. This shift is profound. It moves you from consumption to creation. You no longer live to react to the day. You live to shape the day. When you keep promises to yourself, you also begin to set clearer boundaries, not because you become rigid, but because you respect your energy. You understand that every time you say yes to something unimportant, you are saying no to something more important. And because you have already invested in what matters from the early morning, it becomes easier to decline distractions. These boundaries do not need explanation. They are held through action, and that action is supported by the self-respect built through each morning. One important thing is that when you keep promises to yourself, you stop searching for rescue from the outside. You no longer need constant motivation. You do not need new advice every week. You do not need excitement to begin. You already have a foundation. This foundation allows you to use information selectively. You learn to refine, not to escape. You listen to improve, not to delay. This matures you quickly, not in knowledge, but in your ability to act. Keeping promises to yourself also reveals a truth. Much of the stress in life comes from knowing what you should do and not doing it. That gap creates inner conflict. When you close that gap, stress decreases, not because life has fewer problems, but because you are no longer betraying yourself. This inner integrity brings a deep sense of relief. You no longer carry two versions of yourself, the one you speak about and the one you act as. They become one. And when they become one, you gain strength. Strength does not come from controlling others, but from controlling your own behavior. Once you have built a solid relationship with yourself, you see everything else differently. Failure is no longer an attack on your worth. It becomes information. Success is no longer something to cling to. It becomes a natural result. You do not rise too fast, and you do not fall too hard. You are stable, and this stability allows you to play the long game. In the long game, the winner is not the one who runs fastest, but the one who does not quit. And the one who does not quit is usually the one who trusts themselves the most. Not blind confidence, but evidence-based trust. Evidence from mornings you showed up when no one was watching. Evidence from small promises you kept. Evidence from returning after you fell out of rhythm. These pieces of evidence accumulate into a very strong foundation. When the foundation is strong, you no longer fear change. You know that no matter what happens, you can return to the origin point. That origin point is the morning, where you meet yourself and keep the first promise of the day. From that point, everything else can be rebuilt. Work, relationships, health, goals. You do not need to control everything at once. You only need to protect the origin point. And when you protect it long enough, you realize you are not just building a habit, you are building a way of living where you lead from the inside. By the time you arrive here, you have come very far from where you started. But the journey is not finished. It is moving into its deepest layer. The layer where 5 a.m. is no longer a tactic or a habit. It becomes a life philosophy, a quiet declaration of who you have chosen to become and the legacy you are leaving for yourself. When you reach this point, 5 a.m. is no longer a time marker to debate right or wrong. It has become a philosophy of living, a way you choose to show up for life, quiet, unannounced, but unwavering. You no longer ask whether you have enough motivation. You ask whether today you will fully keep the first promise you make to yourself. And that single question changes everything. Because when you keep the first promise, you lay the foundation for every promise that follows. 5 a.m. teaches you that real power does not come from controlling the world, but from controlling how you begin the day. When you master the starting point, you are no longer pulled by other people's rhythm. You create your own. That rhythm may be fast or slow, but it always has direction. You no longer chase busyness to prove worth. You build value in silence and let results speak on their own. This philosophy seeps into every decision. You choose deep work over constant reaction. You choose quality over quantity. You choose the long game over immediate reward. These choices do not need applause. They are supported by the self-respect you have built through hundreds of mornings. When you look back, you see that the greatest change was not your schedule or productivity, but how you see yourself. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to improve. You see yourself as someone living up to a chosen standard. This difference is subtle but powerful. It gives you calm under pressure, patience while waiting, and clarity when choosing. You do not need to win every day. You only need to not lose direction. And that direction is reaffirmed each morning when you show up for yourself. The legacy of 5 a.m. is not measured by how much you complete. It is measured by who you become along the way. Someone who keeps promises, someone who protects attention, someone who builds in silence. This legacy cannot be taken by external change. It travels with you through every phase. When work shifts, when circumstances change, when goals are adjusted, you still have an origin point to return to. That origin point is not a place. It is a repeated action, waking up, showing up, and leading. You also begin to understand that you do not need to convince anyone to live this way. This philosophy is not for the majority. It is for those willing to take responsibility. You do not need agreement. You only need to continue. Because every morning you hold this choice, you send a quiet message to the future that you are prepared. And when the future arrives, you are not shaken. You have already met it early. 5 a.m. therefore is no longer a habit. It is how you respect time, energy, and yourself. It is a declaration that this life is worth building with intention. And the greatest legacy you leave is not achievement to display. It is the capacity to lead yourself through each day. That capacity stays with you for life. And it begins every morning while the world is still asleep. You have just reached the end of this journey. And if you are still here, that means a very deep part of you is ready to live differently. What you have just heard was not a story meant to create temporary emotion. It was a map that shows why the way you begin each day is quietly determining the entire trajectory of your life. You have seen that 5 a.m. is not just a habit, but a philosophy of living, a way to reclaim control over your attention, your energy, and your direction. You have understood why discipline is not force, but identity. Why small changes repeated every morning can create momentum strong enough to shift an entire life. And why, when you keep promises to yourself, everything else begins to change with it. If this content gave you a new perspective, or caused you to pause and reflect on how you are living, take one small action right now. Press like to support the channel. Share this video with a friend you know also needs to hear this. and subscribe to continue walking alongside deeper stories about mindset, discipline, and the journey of mastering your life from